We are the paradise with thorns. Highgrove House sits in the rolling hills of Gloucestershire, a picture of English perfection. For 45 years, this estate has been King Charles's sanctuary, his escape from the pressures of palace life. The gardens here are legendary. More than 40,000 visitors walk these paths each year, drawn by the promise of organic beauty and royal vision. They see rose gardens and wildflower meadows. They see carefully tended borders and ancient trees. They see what the king wants them to see. But in the summer of 2025, an investigation would reveal something entirely different. Behind the manicured hedges and beneath the carefully orchestrated beauty, investigators found a workplace in crisis. What they discovered would force uncomfortable questions about the man who now wears the crown, about power, about obsession, and about the price others pay for one man's vision of perfection. The investigation began quietly. The King's Foundation, the charity responsible for managing Highgrove, had noticed something alarming in their staffing records. Of the 12 full-time gardeners employed in 2022, 11 had resigned within just 3 years. 2 head gardeners had walked away from positions that should have been the pinnacle of any horticulturist's career. A deputy head gardener had followed them out the door. Something was profoundly wrong. The turnover rate was staggering, even by the standards of an industry known for demanding physical labor and modest pay. But these were not ordinary gardens. And this was not an ordinary employer. This was the private estate of the British monarch, a man who had built his public image on environmental stewardship and organic principles. The irony was not lost on those who knew what was really happening behind Highgrove's gates. The foundation commissioned WorkNest, an independent human resources consultancy, to conduct a formal investigation. The brief was straightforward: determine why so many experienced gardeners were abandoning what should have been dream positions. Interview current and former staff. Review working conditions, management practices, and compensation. Find out what was driving people away from the king's beloved sanctuary. What the investigators found would shake the carefully constructed image of Highgrove as a haven of harmony and ecological balance. The interviews painted a picture of a workplace where demands were relentless, resources were inadequate, and the king's personal involvement had created an atmosphere that multiple staff members described as toxic. One gardener used the phrase that would come to define the investigation's findings: overwhelmed and underpaid. The phrase was simple, but it captured everything. Staff members described working conditions that left them physically exhausted and emotionally drained. They spoke of pressure to meet impossible standards with insufficient resources. They detailed a management structure that seemed more focused on satisfying royal expectations than supporting the people doing the actual work. And they revealed pay rates that seemed almost incomprehensible for such prestigious positions. In March of 2022, 3 gardeners at Highgrove were earning £11.98 per hour. This was the minimum wage. 2 others received £12.78. These were skilled horticulturists, people with years of training and experience working on one of the most famous gardens in Britain. Yet, they were being paid barely more than entry-level retail workers. Jack Stokes, a former senior gardener who had dedicated 2 decades to Highgrove, confirmed the compensation issues when he spoke to investigators. He had left not just because of the pay, but because of burnout. The demands had become unsustainable. The operational changes had made an already difficult job nearly impossible. After 20 years of service to the royal household, he walked away rather than continue under conditions he described as untenable. The investigators heard similar stories from other departing staff. A gardener who had served the monarchy for decades resigned, citing exhaustion and frustration. Another failed to complete their probation period, reportedly because they lacked specific knowledge about a particular variety of flower. This gardener, sources told the investigators, lost the king's trust over this single deficiency. Charles was alleged to have said about this individual, "Do not put that man in front of me again." The phrase was chilling in its implication. It suggested not just high standards, but a kind of personal judgment that went beyond professional expectations. It painted a picture of an employer who did not simply expect excellence, but who took mistakes personally, who saw staff failures as affronts rather than inevitable parts of any complex operation. As the investigation deepened, a pattern emerged. The problems at Highgrove were not isolated incidents or personality conflicts. They were systemic issues rooted in the fundamental way the gardens were managed and, more specifically, in the king's personal involvement in day-to-day operations. Charles had always been hands-on with Highgrove. This was his passion project, his masterpiece. But what looked like dedication from the outside looked very different to those working within it. The king conducted regular walkabouts through the gardens, inspecting every border, examining every plant. These were not casual strolls. They were detailed inspections during which Charles would identify problems, question decisions, and issue directives. Staff members knew that whatever issues the king noticed in the morning would be waiting for them as tasks when he returned for his next walk. The pressure was constant, relentless, inescapable. The investigators documented the communication style that had become notorious among Highgrove staff. Charles sent notes written in thick red ink. These were not brief reminders or gentle suggestions. They were detailed, specific, and, according to multiple sources, often emotional in tone. One memo reportedly instructed staff to remove a single sprouting weed near the perimeter of the swimming pool. Another reprimanded gardeners for grammatical errors in their own internal communications. A third criticized staff after a crop of delphiniums failed to meet expectations. At the center of the Highgrove crisis stood a figure whose name appeared repeatedly in staff complaints. Constantine Inan, known to everyone as Costa. As executive director of Highgrove and one of King Charles's most trusted advisors, Inan occupied a uniquely difficult position. He was the bridge between the king's expectations and the reality of what the gardening staff could actually deliver. And according to the investigation's findings, that bridge had become a breaking point. Former staff members painted a consistent picture of Inan's approach to management. When conflicts arose between professional horticultural advice and the king's wishes, Inan invariably sided with royal preferences. One gardener described a scenario that captured the fundamental problem. If the king wanted a plant moved from location A to location B, but the gardener's professional opinion was that the plant would die as a consequence, Inan's position would be to insist on moving it anyway. This was not simply about following orders. It was about a management philosophy that elevated royal satisfaction above all other considerations, including the welfare of the plants themselves and the professional judgment of trained horticulturists. Staff members reported feeling that their expertise was not valued, that their warnings were not heard, that their role had been reduced to executing royal whims regardless of the consequences. The pressure created by this dynamic was enormous. Gardeners found themselves caught between their professional standards and their employment obligations. They knew what would work and what would not. They understood the needs of different species, the requirements of various seasons, the limitations of soil and climate. But this knowledge, accumulated over years of training and experience, counted for nothing when it conflicted with what the king wanted. The investigation revealed that this tension had physical consequences. Staff members reported injuries sustained while trying to meet demands they considered unrealistic. The gardens at Highgrove are extensive, requiring constant maintenance across multiple distinct areas. With a team that was already described as under-resourced, the pressure to accomplish everything the king expected was taking a toll on bodies as well as morale. One particularly revealing detail emerged about the culture of silence that had developed. Gardeners told investigators they were explicitly discouraged from speaking out about staffing shortages. When they raised concerns about not having enough people to complete required tasks, they were told to find ways to manage. The message was clear: complaints were not welcome. Problems were to be solved, not discussed. The investigation uncovered something else troubling. In the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, King Charles had reportedly suggested using Ukrainian refugees as volunteers in the gardens. He also proposed recruiting elderly people for the same purpose. To staff already struggling with inadequate resources and unrealistic demands, the suggestion felt tone-deaf at best, exploitative at worst. It suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of what professional horticulture requires and what it means to create a functional workplace. The investigators examined the management structure that had allowed these problems to develop. The position of head of gardens had been held by multiple people in quick succession, each departure deepening the crisis. The role required someone who could satisfy the king's exacting standards while also supporting and protecting the staff. It was perhaps an impossible job. The investigation's findings suggested that the position had become unsustainable precisely because those two requirements were fundamentally incompatible. Former head gardeners spoke to investigators on condition of anonymity, describing the impossible pressure of the role. They were expected to be present for the king's walkabouts, to respond immediately to his notes, to ensure that every detail met his standards. But they were also supposed to manage a team, to maintain morale, to ensure safe working conditions. With inadequate staffing and insufficient resources, these responsibilities could not be reconciled. The deputy head gardener, who had resigned, told a similar story. The position should have been a stepping stone to greater responsibility, a chance to learn from experienced leaders and eventually take on a head gardener role. Instead, it had been an exercise in managing competing impossibilities. Please the king or support the staff, meet unrealistic expectations or maintain professional standards, work within impossible constraints or acknowledge that the constraints made success impossible. The investigation documented a particularly revealing incident. A gardener made what was described as a simple mistake, the kind of error that happens in any complex operation. The king's response was to ensure he never had to see that individual again. For the gardening staff, the message was unmistakable. Mistakes were not learning opportunities. They were failures that could end your relationship with the estate, possibly end your career. This created an atmosphere where risk-taking or innovation became impossible. Gardeners focused on avoiding errors rather than excelling at their craft. They became conservative in their approaches, choosing safe options over creative ones. The irony was profound. Highgrove was supposed to be a showcase of innovative organic gardening, but the working environment was stifling the very creativity that such innovation requires. The investigators also examined Innan's background and his relationship with the king. He had served Charles for years, rising to become one of his most relied-upon advisors. This loyalty and closeness made him effective in understanding what the king wanted. But it also made him less able to push back when those wants were unreasonable. Former staff suggested that Innan had become so focused on satisfying Charles that he had lost sight of the human cost. Multiple complaints named Innan specifically as contributing to the toxic atmosphere. But the investigators recognized that he was himself caught in a difficult position. His job was to serve the king, to make Highgrove what Charles envisioned. In a traditional employer-employee relationship, that would be straightforward. But when the vision is unrealistic and the resources are inadequate, even the most dedicated executive director faces impossible choices. The investigation revealed that some staff members had sympathy for Innan's position even as they criticized his decisions. They recognized that he was trying to serve a demanding employer with limited means. But understanding the pressures he faced did not excuse the impact of his management style. The staff needed an advocate, someone who would stand between them and unrealistic demands. Instead, they had someone who transmitted those demands without question or mitigation. The investigators' interviews revealed far more than workplace complaints. They uncovered evidence of deep psychological distress among staff. One gardener described anger constantly at the surface. Another admitted impatience that made even basic politeness difficult. These were not descriptions of a demanding yet healthy workplace, but of people nearing their breaking points. The physical environment at Highgrove told part of the story. The gardens are vast, divided into distinct sections such as the kitchen garden, cottage garden, wildflower meadow, and arboretum. Each area demands specialized knowledge and constant attention. With 12 gardeners, the workload had been manageable. But after 11 left, and only temporary workers and volunteers remained, the task became impossible. Former staff spoke of days beginning before sunrise and ending in darkness. Lunch breaks were skipped because there was always too much to do. They described the constant ache of overworked bodies and exhaustion that no rest could fix. This was not a seasonal strain, but the ongoing reality of life at Highgrove. The investigation highlighted incidents that illustrated the impossible pressures. One growing season, a weather event damaged several plantings. Gardeners explained that restoration would take months, but the king expressed disappointment and demanded quicker results. There was no acknowledgement that nature cannot be rushed. In another instance, the king insisted on overseeing every detail, even the precise shade of roses in a particular bed. A gardener had chosen the varieties best suited to the location, but when they bloomed in a slightly different color, the king's red-ink notes expressed dissatisfaction. The roses were healthy and thriving, but the wrong color erased all value in his eyes. This obsession with perfection extended beyond horticulture. Gardeners received corrections for the way they formatted reports or for spelling errors in internal notes. Their expertise was in cultivation, not paperwork. Yet, they were judged by administrative standards. The psychological impact became painfully evident. Many said nothing they did was ever good enough. They dreaded the king's walkabouts, fearing what he might notice and criticize. Praise was rare, criticism constant. Success was expected, mistakes were remembered. One gardener admitted lying awake at night worrying about unfinished tasks, plants that might fail, and details that could provoke disapproval. This was not carelessness, but devotion turned into anxiety. Others felt the same, and several sought medical help for stress-related conditions. Some suffered headaches, stomach problems, or muscle tension that would not ease. Others battled insomnia and anxiety. These were capable professionals worn down by relentless pressure. The breaking point came when they realized nothing would change. After years of hoping for intervention and months of enduring impossible workloads, they accepted that this was how Highgrove functioned. The king demanded perfection. Management enforced it. Staff either adapted or left. The departures began slowly, then gained momentum. When the first head gardener resigned, it sent shock waves through the team. If even a leader with authority and experience could not endure, what chance did others have? When the second head gardener and then the deputy followed, the message was clear. Highgrove had become a place where good professionals could not thrive. Investigators found that attempts were made to fix the situation before it collapsed. Staff had raised concerns through proper channels, submitted formal complaints, and requested meetings. They were promised reviews of pay scales and staffing, but meaningful change never followed. Temporary measures came instead: small pay increases that still left wages near minimum, vague promises of more staff that never appeared, and morale meetings that produced memos but no action. Nothing touched the real problems. A troubling pattern emerged. Those who pushed hardest for change found themselves marginalized. They were quietly reassigned to undesirable duties or excluded from decision-making. The message was clear, though never spoken: complaints would end your career. This fear silenced honest communication. Gardeners learned to keep problems to themselves, doing their best under impossible conditions. By staying quiet, they protected their jobs but allowed dysfunction to deepen. Management and the king remained unaware of the true consequences of their expectations. Some staff tried to reach out to Innan, hoping he might temper the king's demands or advocate for more resources. But these talks led nowhere. He acknowledged the strain yet insisted that the king's wishes must be met. When gardeners explained why those wishes were unrealistic, they were told to be creative. But creativity cannot replace the laws of nature. Plants grow only as fast as they can. Soil needs rest. Seasons cannot be hurried by royal impatience. The gardeners understood these truths, but at Highgrove, they were treated as excuses rather than expertise. By the time investigators concluded their work, Highgrove's beauty had become a burden. Behind its perfect lawns and elegant blooms lay exhaustion, silence, and a staff too drained to care. The gardens might have looked serene from afar, but beneath the surface they told a different story, a story of devotion stretched beyond endurance, of professionals crushed by impossible expectations, and of a paradise maintained at too high a human cost. When Worknest completed their investigation and delivered their findings to the King's Foundation, the report made for deeply uncomfortable reading. The consultancy confirmed what the resigned staff had said all along. There were serious problems with staffing, management, and pay. The phrase that appeared repeatedly was recruitment and retention. Pay was identified as a major barrier to both hiring and keeping workers. The recommendations were clear and urgent. Management training for all supervisors was declared essential, not optional. Mental health support and counseling were advised for affected staff, acknowledging that working conditions had caused genuine psychological harm. A comprehensive pay review was also urged to correct compensation that was far below what the work demanded. The foundation responded by restructuring leadership, abolishing the head of gardens position and creating a head gardener role. On the surface, this appeared to be a simple title change. In truth, it admitted that the previous structure had failed. The role had become impossible, and rather than fixing the causes, they chose to start again with a new title. The findings created a crisis for the foundation that went beyond management. Highgrove's gardens are profitable, drawing more than 40,000 paying visitors each year. The shop, restaurant, and special events generate strong revenue, and the foundation proudly reported that its operating profit had doubled since 2022. This financial success made the staffing crisis even harder to justify. How could such a profitable estate pay professional horticulturists minimum wage? How could a place built on environmental and ethical values become so toxic that it required mental health interventions? The contradiction demanded answers that never came. The foundation issued a carefully worded statement affirming its commitment to staff welfare and citing annual surveys showing high satisfaction. It highlighted positive achievements such as new educational facilities and rising visitor numbers. It claimed that pay was benchmarked against industry standards and that wages had risen between 15% and 19% since 2022. But the statement avoided the central issues. It did not explain why 11 of 12 gardeners had resigned. It did not mention the king's demanding involvement, nor did it outline concrete steps to prevent a repeat of the crisis. It was crafted to calm public scrutiny, not to show genuine accountability. Investigators also examined the wider context of royal employment. How the royal family treats its staff has become an increasingly sensitive issue, especially after complaints from employees of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Those claims focused on bullying and unrealistic expectations. The Highgrove case echoed similar themes, but stood apart for one reason. These were not media allegations, but verified findings from an investigation commissioned by the foundation itself. That distinction mattered. When ex-employees speak out, their motives are often questioned. But when an organization's own investigation confirms deep problems, it carries undeniable weight. The foundation had sought the truth, and the truth was uncomfortable. The investigation highlighted the unique difficulty of working for royalty. In a normal workplace, employees have legal protections, clear structures, and someone to appeal to. But when your employer is the King of England, those structures blur. Who can you complain to when the source of the problem is the monarch? What protection exists when management's priority is royal satisfaction rather than employee welfare? The gardeners learned the answer the hard way. They could file complaints, but those complaints went through people loyal to the king. They could voice concerns, but those concerns would be filtered to avoid offending royal expectations. Eventually, most chose to leave. Despite their suffering, many former employees expressed genuine affection for King Charles. They admired his passion for the gardens, his love of nature, and his deep knowledge of plants. They acknowledged that his intentions were good and his vision sincere. Yet, those same qualities became their burden. His perfectionism and need for control created impossible pressure. His position of authority meant no one dared tell him when his expectations were unreasonable. This made the problem complex. It would be simpler if he had been indifferent or cruel. Instead, he was a man whose devotion to his vision overwhelmed those trying to fulfill it. His passion for perfection crossed the line into unsustainable demand. Investigators recorded staff struggling to express this balance. They did not wish to portray the king as a villain, but they needed to show that his standards, enforced without limit, had caused real harm. The issue was not personal resentment, but structural imbalance, an environment where one person's vision outweighed the well-being of everyone else. The recommendation for mental health support underscored how serious the situation had become. This was not routine workplace counseling, but intervention for damage caused by the job itself. Investigators concluded that several staff members required help to recover from their time at Highgrove. Former gardeners described lingering effects long after leaving. Some developed anxiety that followed them into new jobs. Others found it hard to trust that future employers would be reasonable. Some battled physical symptoms like muscle tension and sleeplessness that took months to fade. What should have been a prestigious role had instead left scars. The foundation's defense regarding pay was equally revealing. While it claimed to benchmark wages against industry norms, investigators found that these benchmarks were the legal minimums, not professional standards. Paying trained horticulturists the lowest lawful wage was technically acceptable, but clearly signaled that their expertise was undervalued. Ultimately, the Work Nest report painted a portrait of contradiction, a world-famous estate celebrated for its beauty, but sustained by underpaid, overstressed workers. A royal employer admired for his environmental ideals, yet blind to the human cost of his perfectionism. And a foundation that sought the truth, but hesitated to act on it. The findings left one clear conclusion. The problem at Highgrove was not a lack of passion or purpose. It was a system where devotion turned into domination, where excellence demanded too high a price, and where those who kept the gardens alive paid for that beauty with their peace of mind. The investigation into working conditions at Highgrove raised questions that extended far beyond one royal estate in Gloucestershire. They touched on fundamental issues about power, about privilege, and about what we expect from institutions that present themselves as exemplars of certain values. King Charles has built much of his public identity around environmental consciousness, organic farming, and sustainable living. Highgrove has been central to that image, a living demonstration of his principles in action. But the investigation revealed a troubling disconnect between the public image and the private reality. The gardens that symbolized harmony with nature were maintained by workers in conditions that multiple sources described as harmful. The organic principles that emphasized working with natural systems rather than against them were being imposed through management practices that worked against human well-being rather than supporting it. The sustainability that Charles championed in ecological terms was notably absent when it came to sustaining a healthy, functional workforce. This disconnect is not unique to Highgrove. It appears throughout institutions where idealistic missions exist alongside problematic practices. Universities that espouse progressive values while paying adjunct faculty poverty wages. Non-profit organizations that serve vulnerable populations while creating toxic workplaces for their own staff. Companies that market themselves on ethical principles while exploiting workers in their supply chains. The pattern is familiar. Noble intentions at the top, harmful realities at the bottom. What makes the Highgrove case particularly striking is that the person at the top is not a distant CEO or an anonymous board of directors. It is the King of England, someone with extraordinary resources and authority. If anyone could ensure that their passionate commitment to a place was not achieved at the expense of the people maintaining it, one might expect it would be someone in his position. Yet the investigation suggests that his very passion, combined with his position of unquestionable authority, contributed to the problem rather than preventing it. The red ink notes have become symbolic of something larger. They represent a communication style that flows in only one direction. From authority to subordinate, never the reverse. In a healthy workplace, feedback moves both ways. Employees can tell employers when expectations are unrealistic, when resources are insufficient, when demands are causing harm. But at Highgrove, the communication was one way. The king sent notes. The staff received them. There was no mechanism for the staff to send notes back explaining why what he wanted was impossible or harmful. This asymmetry is inherent in royal employment, but it does not have to be destructive. Other members of the royal family have managed to maintain high standards while also creating functional workplaces. The difference appears to be in the degree of personal involvement and the willingness to accept feedback. When an employer is deeply involved in daily operations but unwilling to hear that their involvement is causing problems, the result is what the investigators found at Highgrove. The suggestion about using Ukrainian refugees or elderly volunteers was particularly revealing. It showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what professional horticulture requires and what constitutes ethical employment. Gardens of Highgrove scale and complexity need trained professionals who are fairly compensated for skilled work. Suggesting that they could be maintained by vulnerable people doing unpaid labor was tone-deaf in ways that highlighted how disconnected royal thinking can be from the realities of work and workers. The investigation documented that complaints about this suggestion were raised internally, but there is no record of anyone explaining to Charles why it was inappropriate. This again illustrates the communication problem. Staff members could complain to each other and to middle management, but their concerns never reached the person who most needed to hear them. The system protected the king from feedback that might have helped him understand the impact of his ideas. The long-term implications of the Highgrove crisis remain unclear. The Foundation has made some changes restructuring leadership, implementing the investigation's recommendations, presumably trying to create conditions that will stop the exodus of staff. But unless the fundamental dynamics change, unless someone can find a way to moderate the king's personal involvement or at least ensure his demands are realistic, the same problems are likely to recur. Former staff members interviewed by investigators expressed skepticism that anything would truly change. They had seen promises before, experienced temporary improvements that faded once attention moved elsewhere. They noted that the king's personality and expectations were constants that no amount of restructuring could alter. As long as Charles remained as invested in minute details and as sensitive to imperfection, working at Highgrove would remain difficult. The investigation also raised questions about oversight and accountability. The King's Foundation operates as a charity, which means it has trustees and governance structures meant to ensure responsible operation. Yet, these systems apparently failed to prevent or address a workplace crisis that resulted in nearly total staff turnover. What does it say about charitable governance when an organization can lose 11 of 12 employees in a key department without triggering earlier intervention? The public response to news of the investigation was mixed. Some defended the king, arguing that high standards are not the same as poor treatment, that demanding excellence is a leader's prerogative. Others pointed to the investigation's findings as evidence that Charles remained out of touch with ordinary working people despite decades of public service. Still others saw it as confirmation that hereditary privilege inevitably creates power imbalances that harm those at the bottom. What the investigation undeniably revealed was a human cost that had been invisible to the 40,000 annual visitors who walk through Highgrove's beautiful gardens. They see the results of the work, the perfectly maintained borders, the thriving plants, the aesthetic harmony that Charles has created. They do not see the people who resigned rather than continue working under the conditions required to maintain that perfection. They do not know about the red ink notes, the impossible expectations, the staff who needed counseling after working in a garden. The investigators' final report contained a recommendation that went beyond the specific issues at Highgrove. It suggested that organizations managed by or closely associated with the royal family needed to implement stronger protections for workers, clearer mechanisms for raising concerns, and more robust oversight to ensure that royal involvement enhanced rather than undermined workplace conditions. Whether this recommendation will be implemented more broadly remains to be seen. For the gardeners who left Highgrove, the investigation's findings provided a form of validation. Their experiences had been documented. Their complaints had been confirmed by independent investigators. The problems they had tried to raise had been officially acknowledged. This did not undo the harm they had experienced, but it meant they had not suffered in vain. Their departures had forced a reckoning that might eventually lead to better conditions for whoever comes after them. But questions remain about King Charles himself. Has he been made aware of the investigation's full findings? Does he understand the role his personal management style played in creating conditions that drove away 11 skilled professionals? Has anyone found a way to tell him that his passion for his garden, while admirable, has been expressed in ways that harm the people who share that passion and do the actual work of maintaining it? Or is he insulated by layers of management from ever having to confront these uncomfortable truths? The red ink notes continue, presumably, though perhaps with slightly more awareness of their impact. The expectations remain high, though perhaps with some recognition that they need to be balanced against human limitations. The gardens themselves remain beautiful, a testament to decades of vision and care. But now we know the price of that beauty, measured not in pounds and pence alone, but in human well-being and professional lives disrupted by conditions that should never have been allowed to develop at a place meant to represent harmony with nature. The investigation at Highgrove revealed a truth that extends beyond royal gardens. Passion without empathy can become oppression, and beautiful results can hide harmful processes. As the King's Foundation implements changes, the question remains whether genuine transformation is possible when power remains concentrated in one person's vision and authority. Subscribe for more investigations into the hidden stories behind royal magnificence.